Sometimes, the places we leave behind are the ones still waiting for us to come home. Ethan Walker had not planned to stay long. The old ranch sat nearly 40 miles outside Amarillo, Texas, surrounded by open pasture that had long surrendered to weeds taller than a man's knee and fences bent crooked by years of hard wind and neglect. The place looked smaller than he remembered, quieter too, like time itself had slowly folded into the dry earth and settled there beside the dust. His grandfather had been gone for almost 17 years, and nobody in the family had touched the property since. Most people thought it should have been sold long ago. Ethan himself had once agreed. But life had a strange way of humbling a man before bringing him back to where he began. His old pickup rattled softly as it rolled down the gravel driveway, tires crunching against loose stones while late afternoon sunlight stretched long shadows across the field. Beside him sat Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd with alert amber eyes and ears sharp enough to hear trouble before it arrived. Ranger had been with Ethan through more lonely nights than he cared to count, through motel parking lots, truck stop coffee, quiet mornings, and the kind of silence that only came after too much loss. Ethan reached down and scratched the dog gently behind the ear. "Almost there, buddy," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if he meant the ranch or something else entirely. The truth was, Ethan had nowhere left to go. After years of drifting from one construction job to another, after the divorce papers had come and the savings disappeared faster than pride would allow him to admit, this forgotten ranch had become less of an inheritance and more of a last stop. He stepped out of the truck, boots sinking slightly into dry dirt, and breathed in the familiar smell of cedar, old hay, and distant rain hanging somewhere beyond the horizon. The farmhouse stood weathered but stubborn, its faded white paint peeling under years of Texas heat. One porch rail leaned sideways, and one upstairs window sat cracked like an old scar refusing to heal. Yet somehow, despite everything, the place still felt alive. Ranger jumped from the truck and stood perfectly still. That alone caught Ethan's attention. Usually the dog moved fast, nose to the ground, checking every scent with military precision. But now Ranger simply stared, not at the house, not at the trees. His body was angled toward the far end of the property where the old barn stood half hidden behind overgrown grass and rusted fencing. His ears lifted, his posture stiffened. Then, without making a sound, he slowly walked in that direction. Ethan frowned. "Hey," he called lightly. "We're checking the house first." Ranger stopped for half a second but didn't turn around. Instead, he kept staring at the barn as if listening to something Ethan couldn't hear. The barn roof sagged slightly on one side, weather-beaten boards darkened by time and storms. Ethan remembered climbing there as a kid with his grandfather, remembered the smell of horses, old rope, sawdust, and stories told under dim lantern light when the world felt simpler than it turned out to be. But standing there now, something about the place felt different. Not dangerous, just waiting. Ranger finally turned back, but not before glancing once more toward the shadowed barn doors, his eyes fixed in a way Ethan had learned never to ignore. Somewhere above, wind brushed softly through old tree branches, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt the strange feeling that maybe he had not returned here by accident. Perhaps some places remember kindness longer than people do. The front door groaned softly when Ethan pushed it open, the sound stretching through the empty house, like something waking from a long sleep. Dust drifted through fading sunlight that slipped between crooked blinds, painting long golden lines across furniture covered in white sheets. The air smelled faintly of cedar wood, old paper, and time itself. Ethan stood still for a moment, one hand resting on the doorframe, letting memories settle around him before he stepped inside. He could almost hear his grandfather's slow footsteps crossing the hardwood floor, could almost picture him standing near the kitchen stove with black coffee steaming beside him before sunrise. Some places held silence differently. This house did not feel abandoned. It felt paused. Ranger entered slowly behind him, but stopped near the doorway. Ethan noticed it immediately. Usually the German shepherd searched every room, nose low, tail moving with quiet curiosity. Not this time. Ranger glanced around the house only briefly before looking toward the back window where the barn sat in the distance. His ears twitched once, then twice. "What is it with you today?" Ethan asked quietly, setting his worn duffel bag near the staircase. Ranger did not move. He simply stared outside. Ethan shook his head and walked deeper into the house. The kitchen looked nearly untouched except for the dust. Old cast iron pans still hung where they always had. A cracked ceramic bowl sat beside the sink, and above the refrigerator hung the same faded calendar from years ago, frozen in a month nobody had bothered to change. It made his chest tighten in ways he did not expect. Life moved fast after grief. Sometimes too fast. People packed memories into boxes because standing still hurt too much. Ethan opened cabinets one by one, finding canned food long expired, stacks of yellowed newspapers, and jars filled with rusted nails his grandfather had somehow believed might still become useful one day. In the living room, an old clock rested above the fireplace. He glanced at it absent-mindedly and nearly stopped breathing when he realized the second hand still moved. Tick, 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 perfectly steady. Ethan frowned. There was no electricity. There had not been for years. He stepped closer, confused, wondering if someone had replaced the battery recently. But who would have come here? Nobody in the family even spoke about the ranch anymore. Ranger suddenly stood up. His nails clicked sharply against the floor as he walked to the hallway and stopped near the back door. A low sound escaped his throat, not quite a growl, more like concern. Ethan turned. You hear something? Outside, wind brushed gently through the pasture, carrying the dry scent of hay and distant rain. Nothing unusual. Still, Ranger remained alert, eyes fixed toward the barn again. Ethan tried to ignore it. He had spent enough nights sleeping in truck stops to know exhaustion could make ordinary things feel strange. He grabbed a broom from the pantry and opened a window to let fresh air inside. Evening light deepened outside, turning the sky into soft shades of orange and blue. Then, as Ethan walked into the dining room, he noticed something else that did not make sense. Near the back hallway, resting carefully on a small wooden table, sat a lantern. Clean, polished, no dust anywhere. Beside it lay a folded piece of paper yellowed by age, and across the front, written in familiar handwriting he had not seen since he was a boy, were 5 simple words. For when you come back. Sometimes the heart notices something important before the mind is ready to understand it. Ethan stood still for several seconds, the folded paper resting carefully between his fingers as if moving too quickly might somehow make it disappear. The handwriting belonged to his grandfather. There was no doubt about that. The slightly uneven letters, the way the word back leaned lower than the rest. Even the pressure of the pen pressed deep into the paper felt painfully familiar. For a moment, the house around him faded into silence. He remembered sitting at the old kitchen table as a boy while his grandfather scribbled grocery lists or notes for ranch repairs, always pausing halfway through to tell stories that somehow sounded ordinary and important at the same time. Ethan slowly unfolded the paper, expecting a letter, maybe instructions, or a memory someone had forgotten to mention after the funeral. But inside there was only a short sentence written in faded ink. Trust what the dog notices. Ethan blinked once, confused. Then again, a small, uneasy laugh escaped him under his breath. That sounds like you, he muttered softly, shaking his head. Ranger stood near the back door, unmoving, his eyes fixed toward the barn as though he had not heard a word. Outside, daylight softened into evening, shadows stretching across the pasture while a cool breeze rattled dry grass near the fence line. Ethan slipped the note into his jacket pocket and stepped onto the back porch. The ranch spread wide beneath the fading Texas sky, peaceful in the way forgotten places often were. Yet the stillness felt different now, intentional somehow, like something had quietly waited all these years for someone to finally return. Ranger moved first. He trotted down the porch steps without hesitation and headed directly toward the barn again. Ethan followed more slowly, boots pressing against cracked dirt as old memories returned with every step. He remembered feeding horses beside his grandfather before sunrise, remembered laughter echoing through summer heat, remembered being told more than once never to play near the western side of the barn because the floorboards there were weak. Funny how children remembered warnings long after forgetting the reasons behind them. The closer they got, the older the barn looked. Weather had not been kind to it. Several wooden planks leaned loose along the walls, and patches of rust spread across metal hinges like stains left behind by time. One side of the roof dipped lower than Ethan remembered, and tall weeds crowded the edges like nature slowly reclaiming what people stopped protecting. Ranger stopped 10 feet from the doors. His body stiffened again. Not fear. Focus. His ears tilted forward sharply. Ethan listened carefully. Wind. Birds somewhere far off. The faint creak of wood shifting in cooling evening air. Nothing unusual. Yet Ranger refused to move. Then, slowly, the German shepherd walked toward the barn entrance and sat down directly in front of it. Waiting. Ethan sighed quietly. All right, he said. You win. He stepped closer and reached for the heavy wooden door. It resisted at first, swollen from years of heat and rain before finally groaning open with a deep, tired sound that echoed into darkness. The smell inside stopped him immediately. Dust. Old hay. Cedar wood. Rusted metal. Memories. Golden light spilled through cracks in the barn walls, stretching long beams across forgotten tools and empty horse stalls. Everything looked untouched. Frozen in time. Ranger entered without hesitation, his paws moving carefully over weathered boards. He ignored every corner except one. Near the back left wall, half hidden behind stacked crates and old farm equipment, he stopped. Then he lowered his nose to the floor and scratched once against the wood. Ethan frowned. What are you trying to show me? Ranger scratched again. Slower this time. Deliberate. Beneath the old barn, something sounded different. Hollow. Ranger scratched the same spot again, slower now. Almost patient, as though he already knew something Ethan had not yet figured out. The sound echoed softly through the quiet barn, wood against claw, sharp enough to cut through the old stillness hanging in the air. Ethan crouched beside him and pressed his palm against the floorboards. Dust clung to his skin. The wood felt colder there than the rest of the barn. He knocked gently with his knuckles once, then again. Solid. But 2 feet over, near where Ranger sat waiting, the sound changed. Hollow. Ethan paused. He looked around the barn, half expecting to find some obvious explanation, maybe an old storage compartment or broken foundation left behind by time. Yet something about it unsettled him in a way he could not explain. The barn had always felt ordinary when he was a child. A little worn down maybe, full of rope and feed sacks and the smell of horses after rain, but ordinary. Now standing there years later, with daylight fading and silence stretching longer between every sound, the place seemed to carry secrets it had grown tired of hiding. Ranger nudged Ethan's arm with his nose, then looked back toward the floor again. All right, Ethan said quietly. I hear you. He stood and began moving old crates stacked nearby, each one heavier than it looked. Dust floated through beams of amber sunlight cutting between the boards overhead. Beneath one rusted wheelbarrow and an overturned wooden shelf, he noticed something strange. The floorboards in that corner looked newer than the others. Not new exactly, but newer. Less warped, less faded by age. And near one edge of the plank, barely visible beneath dirt and hay, someone had carved a small mark into the wood. Ethan brushed it clean with his sleeve and froze. It was a tiny symbol he recognized immediately. A star inside a horseshoe. His grandfather used to carve it onto things he wanted kept safe. Ethan had seen it on old tackle boxes, fence posts, even the fishing rod they used together every summer. No way, he whispered. Ranger sat beside him, watching quietly. Ethan glanced toward the open barn doors where evening had nearly arrived. The sky outside had softened into deep shades of purple and gold, wind brushing through tall grass with a low whisper that somehow made the silence inside feel even heavier. He reached for an old crowbar leaning against the wall and hesitated. A part of him suddenly felt foolish. Tired men imagined things. Lonely men sometimes held on to mystery because reality had already disappointed them too many times. Maybe there was nothing beneath the floor except empty space. Maybe his grandfather had repaired the boards years ago and forgotten about it. Still, that note sat folded in Ethan's jacket pocket like a quiet voice refusing to leave him alone. Trust what the dog notices. Ranger stood suddenly. His ears lifted. Then he turned toward the far end of the barn, staring into shadows near an old workbench. Ethan followed his gaze and listened. For several seconds, there was nothing except the sound of evening settling over the ranch. Then came a faint creak. Slow, soft, almost like old wood shifting under weight somewhere inside the barn. Ethan frowned. The place had been empty for years. At least, that was what he had believed. Ranger did not bark. He simply stood perfectly still, alert and calm, eyes fixed on the darkness ahead, as if waiting for Ethan to finally understand that whatever this place had been holding onto all these years, it had not stayed forgotten by accident. The sound came again, softer this time, somewhere near the old workbench tucked against the far wall of the barn. Ethan stood perfectly still, crowbar resting loosely in his hand, while Ranger remained locked in place beside him, ears raised, eyes fixed ahead with calm concentration. It was not the kind of alertness Ethan associated with fear. Ranger had learned fear years ago and left it behind. This was something else. Focus. Like the dog had sensed a pattern Ethan had not yet noticed. The fading sunlight stretched thinner across the barn floor now, leaving long shadows between rusted tools and forgotten shelves. Ethan took a slow breath and stepped carefully toward the workbench. Every board beneath his boots creaked softly with age. Dust floated through the air each time he moved, disturbed after years of silence. Probably an animal, he muttered quietly to himself, though the words sounded less convincing once spoken aloud. A raccoon maybe, or wind shifting old wood. Old places made sounds. He knew that, but something about this ranch felt different with every passing hour. Ranger moved ahead of him without hesitation, stopping near the wall beside the bench. His nose lifted slightly into the air before lowering toward the floor again. Then he looked back at Ethan, waiting. The same look he used to give during difficult moments when they worked together through training exercises. Not panic. Trust me. Ethan crouched near the workbench and noticed something strange immediately. A thin layer of dust covered almost everything in the barn except one narrow section of floor near the wall. It was faint, easy to miss, but someone or something had disturbed the dust there more recently than the rest of the room. Not footprints exactly, more like movement. He reached down and brushed aside loose hay with his hand. Beneath it sat several old glass jars, rusted horseshoes, and tucked between them, something wrapped carefully in cloth. Ethan hesitated before picking it up. The fabric felt dry and brittle with age. Slowly, he unwrapped it and found an old brass key, heavier than expected, cold against his palm despite the warmth still trapped inside the barn. A small horseshoe symbol had been carved into the handle. The same mark from the floorboard. Ethan stared at it for several long seconds. "What were you hiding?" he whispered under his breath. Ranger nudged his elbow once, impatient now. Then the German shepherd walked back toward the hollow section of floor and sat beside it again. Deliberate. Ethan looked between the key and the marked planks. Somewhere outside, thunder rolled softly in the distance, low and steady, carrying the smell of rain across the ranch. Texas storms moved fast this time of year. Evening shadows deepened around them. Ethan checked his watch and realized he had spent nearly 2 hours inside the barn without noticing. Strange how time moved differently in old places. He stood slowly, slipping the brass key into his jacket pocket. Part of him wanted to leave it for tomorrow. Get food in town. Sleep. Think clearly in daylight. Yet another part of him, quieter but stronger, felt something he had not felt in years. Curiosity. Hope maybe. Not the loud kind people talked about. Just the small, fragile kind that arrived quietly after life had taken almost everything else. Ranger scratched once more against the hollow floorboard. Outside, wind brushed against the barn walls, and somewhere overhead the first raindrops tapped gently against old metal roofing. Ethan looked at the marked planks one last time and tightened his grip on the crowbar. Whatever his grandfather had left behind, it had not been forgotten. It had been waiting. Rain settled over the ranch in a slow, steady rhythm, tapping against the barn roof like quiet fingers remembering an old song. Ethan stood over the marked floorboards for another minute, crowbar still in hand, uncertainty pulling against curiosity in equal measure. Common sense told him to wait until morning. He had barely slept the night before, spent most of the week driving, and exhaustion had a way of making ordinary things feel larger than they were. Yet every time he glanced at Ranger, the German shepherd remained seated beside the hollow spot, as though standing guard over something important. Patient. Certain. Ethan had learned long ago not to ignore that look. "You really are not letting this go tonight, are you?" he asked quietly. Ranger tilted his head once, but stayed exactly where he was. Thunder rolled somewhere farther west, softer now, while cool air drifted through the cracks in the barn walls carrying the scent of rain-soaked dirt. Ethan finally exhaled and crouched beside the floorboards again. He slid the edge of the crowbar carefully beneath one loose plank and pressed downward. At first, nothing moved. The wood groaned softly with resistance, stiff from years of heat and weather. He adjusted his grip and tried again. This time, the board lifted slightly with a dry cracking sound, sending dust into the air. Ranger immediately stood and stepped closer. Beneath the plank sat darkness. Not empty space exactly. More like a narrow compartment built between the support beams under the barn floor. Ethan pulled aside another board carefully and leaned lower, trying to see inside through the dim light. He reached for his flashlight resting near the workbench and switched it on. The beam revealed something wrapped neatly in thick canvas, tucked into the corner as though someone had hidden it with care. Not forgotten. Protected. Ethan hesitated before reaching inside. The compartment smelled faintly of cedar and machine oil, strangely preserved despite the passing years. Whatever rested down there had been sealed away on purpose. He carefully lifted the bundle out and placed it onto the dusty floor. Ranger sat close beside him, watching every movement with complete focus. Ethan pulled back the old canvas slowly. Inside sat a small weathered wooden box, about 18 inches wide, reinforced with faded brass corners. The same horseshoe and star symbol had been burned into the lid. His grandfather's mark. Ethan swallowed hard. A strange feeling settled over him then, difficult to name. Not excitement exactly. Something quieter. The feeling of standing close to an answer before knowing the question. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the brass key Ranger had helped him find near the workbench. The size matched perfectly with the small lock at the front of the box. Ethan paused. Outside, rain fell harder now, drumming steadily against the roof while wind brushed through the pasture beyond the barn walls. Somewhere in the distance, lightning flickered faintly behind thick clouds, casting soft silver flashes through narrow cracks in the wood. The ranch suddenly felt impossibly far from everything else. Just him, Ranger, the storm, and something left behind by a man he had not stopped missing, even after all these years. Slowly, Ethan inserted the key into the lock. It turned with surprising ease. No rust, no struggle, almost as though someone had expected this moment eventually to arrive. But before he could lift the lid, Ranger suddenly stood and turned sharply toward the barn entrance, ears raised high. Then came the unmistakable sound of tires crunching slowly across wet gravel outside. The sound of tires slowed outside before stopping completely near the farmhouse, muffled by steady rain and distance, but unmistakable all the same. Ethan remained crouched beside the unlocked wooden box, one hand resting lightly against the lid while Ranger stood rigid near the barn entrance, every muscle alert. For a moment, neither moved. The storm seemed to settle around them, rain tapping softly against metal roofing while wind slipped through narrow gaps in the barn walls carrying the cold smell of wet earth. Ethan listened carefully. No car doors yet. No voices. Just silence. Strange silence. The kind that made ordinary things feel important. He looked at Ranger. "Stay here," he said quietly, though they both knew the dog rarely listened when instinct told him otherwise. Ethan stood and slipped the brass key back into his pocket, leaving the unopened box where it rested on the floor beside the hidden compartment. Something about the timing unsettled him. Nobody knew he was here. At least, nobody should have. The ranch had been forgotten by most of the family years ago, spoken about only when property taxes came due or someone joked that the place probably had more snakes than value left in it. Yet now, on the very evening he returned, someone appeared in the middle of a storm. Ranger moved beside him as Ethan crossed the barn, flashlight beam cutting softly through darkness. When he stepped outside, cool rain brushed across his jacket immediately. The sky had turned deep charcoal gray, thunder rumbling quietly somewhere far beyond the hills. Parked near the front of the house sat an older white pickup truck streaked with mud, headlights still glowing faintly through rain. Ethan did not recognize it. A figure stood near the porch steps, tall and broad-shouldered beneath a faded brown raincoat, hat pulled low against the weather. The man looked older, maybe late 60s, though sturdy in the way ranch men often stayed sturdy even after time tried its best to slow them down. He held no umbrella, just stood there waiting with hands resting calmly in his coat pockets. Ranger slowed beside Ethan, but did not growl. That caught Ethan's attention immediately. The dog trusted very few people. "You Ethan Walker?" The man finally called out over the rain. His voice carried the rough warmth of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors. Ethan stopped several feet away. Depends who is asking. The older man gave a quiet half-smile. Name is Walter Hayes. Neighbor down the road. Been watching over this place from a distance since your granddad passed. Ethan studied him carefully. There was something familiar in the man's face, though he could not place it right away. Maybe he had seen him once as a kid. Maybe not. Walter glanced briefly toward the barn, then toward Ranger standing beside Ethan. That dog of yours, he said quietly, looks a lot smarter than most people around here. Ethan gave the faintest smile despite himself. Sometimes. Walter nodded once, thoughtful. Rain gathered along the brim of his hat. Your grandfather used to say animals notice what folks miss. He paused, especially around that barn. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. You knew him well. Walter looked past him toward the pasture stretching into darkness. About as well as anybody did. His expression shifted then, quieter somehow. More careful. Look, son, I almost did not come tonight. But once I saw lights on in the house, I figured you deserved to know something. He hesitated before speaking again. Your grandfather never trusted banks. And there are folks who spent years wondering what he left behind. Ranger stepped closer to Ethan's side. Calm. Watching. Waiting. Walter lowered his voice slightly. If that dog starts paying attention to something around here, he said, glancing once more toward the barn, I would suggest you do the same. Walter stayed only a few minutes longer, just long enough to leave behind more questions than answers. Rain softened around them while thunder drifted farther into the distance, the storm settling into a quiet, steady rhythm across the ranch. Ethan stood beneath the porch awning listening as the older man spoke carefully, as though every word mattered more than it first appeared. Your grandfather was a good man, Walter said, eyes drifting toward the dark pasture beyond the fence line. But he carried things he never talked about much. Folks around here respected him. Some feared him too. Ethan frowned slightly. Feared him. Walter gave a quiet shrug. Not because he was dangerous. Because he knew things. Helped people when nobody else would. And because he never let go of this land, no matter how many offers came. He hesitated. Big offers. Ethan folded his arms against the cold, damp air. For ranch land. Walter gave him a look that suggested the answer was not so simple. That is what puzzled everybody. Ranger sat calmly beside Ethan, watching Walter with quiet focus. Not distrust. Interest. Walter nodded toward the dog. Funny thing, he said. Your grandfather had a shepherd too. Smartest dog I ever saw. Stayed close to that barn near the end. Ethan felt something tighten quietly in his chest. I do not remember that. You were still young then, Walter replied softly. After your grandma passed, your granddad spent more time out there. Said some things were worth protecting even if people stopped understanding why. The words lingered in the air between them. Ethan almost mentioned the hidden compartment. The key. The box sitting unlocked inside the barn waiting to be opened. But instinct stopped him. Something told him not to speak too quickly. Not yet. Walter stepped toward his truck and paused before opening the door. One more thing, he said. There were people asking questions after the funeral. Family. Outsiders too. Some believed your grandfather hid something important before he died. Ethan stayed quiet. Walter studied him carefully for a moment, then nodded toward the barn one final time. If you find something, he said gently, do not rush to trust everybody. He tipped his hat slightly, especially people who suddenly remember family when money gets involved. Then he climbed into the truck and drove slowly back down the gravel road, headlights fading into the rain until darkness swallowed them completely. For several long seconds, Ethan stood there listening to the quiet again. Wind moved gently through trees near the house. Rain tapped softly against the porch roof. Somewhere nearby, Ranger shifted his weight and turned toward the barn once more. Waiting. Ethan looked down at the German shepherd and sighed quietly. Guess we are not sleeping anytime soon. Ranger stood immediately, tail low but steady, already moving toward the barn as though the conversation had only confirmed what he somehow knew all along. Inside, the old wooden structure felt darker now, smaller somehow beneath storm clouds and flickering lightning far away. Yet the hidden box remained exactly where Ethan had left it, resting beside the lifted floorboards beneath the workbench. Waiting. Ethan crouched beside it again, heart beating a little harder than before. He reached toward the lid slowly, pausing only once when Ranger stepped closer, and rested quietly beside him. Somehow, having the dog there made the silence feel less heavy, less lonely. Ethan finally lifted the lid. Inside sat several carefully wrapped items layered beneath folded cloth. A leather journal worn soft with age. An old silver pocket watch stopped at exactly 6:17. A stack of sealed envelopes tied neatly together with faded string. And resting beneath everything else, folded carefully beside a yellowed map of the ranch, sat a handwritten letter. On the front, written in familiar steady ink, were words Ethan never expected to see. For Ethan, when Ranger leads you here. For several seconds, Ethan could only stare at the handwriting. Rain continued falling softly overhead, the barn wrapped in the kind of quiet that made ordinary moments feel impossible to explain. Ranger rested beside him now, calm again, one paw stretched across the dusty floor as though his job had somehow already been completed. Ethan picked up the letter carefully, turning it over once in disbelief. The paper looked old, edges softened by time, but his name stood clear and steady across the front. For Ethan, when Ranger leads you here. His throat tightened unexpectedly. How could he know? He whispered quietly. Ranger lifted his head at the sound of his voice, but said nothing, only watched with those steady amber eyes that somehow always seemed to understand more than they should. Ethan broke the seal carefully and unfolded the pages. The familiar handwriting filled every line, steady and patient in the way his grandfather used to speak when he wanted someone to truly listen. Ethan, if you are reading this, then life probably knocked you around some. I always hoped it would not, but I knew enough about this world to understand that hard times visit good people too. If Ranger found this first, trust him. Dogs notice what matters long before people do. Ethan stopped reading for a moment, heart pulling strangely in his chest. His grandfather had passed nearly 2 decades ago, and still somehow the words sounded alive. Like sitting beside him on the porch again after sunset while the old man talked quietly about weather, hard work, and the importance of keeping your word. Ethan kept reading. I have watched this family spend years arguing about money that never mattered and forgetting things that always did. This land is not valuable because of what is buried in it. It matters because of what people built here together. If you came back, I think that means somewhere deep down, you were still searching for home. Ethan swallowed hard. Outside, thunder rolled faintly again, softer now as the storm drifted farther east. He glanced at Ranger briefly, then continued. There are things hidden on this ranch, because some folks cannot tell the difference between value and greed. I trusted very few people near the end, but I trusted Walter Hayes. If he is still around, listen carefully when he speaks. And Ethan, there is something important beneath this place, but before you go chasing answers, understand this. The real inheritance is not money. If all you find is peace, that will already be enough. Ethan lowered the letter slowly. Peace. The word lingered strangely in the quiet. He had spent years surviving, moving, working wherever he could, sleeping in cheap motels or the truck when money ran thin. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped thinking about peace entirely. Ranger stood suddenly and moved closer to the open box again. Ethan looked down and noticed the folded ranch map beneath the remaining items. It had markings drawn across sections of land in faded red ink. Small circles, arrows, notes written carefully in the margins. One mark stood out immediately, a red X near the western side of the property beside a handwritten message. Old spring house. Do not trust appearances. Ethan frowned. He remembered the spring house vaguely from childhood. Small, crumbling, forgotten, half swallowed by weeds near the creek behind the pasture. Nobody had used it in years. Beneath the map rested one final envelope, smaller than the others. Ethan opened it carefully and found only a single photograph tucked inside. The picture showed his grandfather standing outside the barn many years ago beside another German shepherd nearly identical to Ranger. On the back, written in faded ink, were 6 quiet words that made the room suddenly feel smaller. Some things choose who finds them. Sleep never really came that night. Ethan tried once, stretching out on the old couch inside the farmhouse with Ranger resting near the front door, but every time he closed his eyes, the letter returned to him. The handwriting, the strange certainty in his grandfather's words. And more than anything, the map folded carefully beside the box, marked with a red X near the forgotten spring house by the creek. Around 3 in the morning, rain softened into silence. By dawn, Pale gray light drifted slowly across the ranch, carrying the clean smell of wet earth through cracked windows. Ethan sat at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee that tasted far worse than he remembered his grandfather ever making. The folded map spread carefully beside him. Ranger rested nearby, though every few minutes the German shepherd lifted his head toward the back pasture, as if reminding Ethan something still waited there. The spring house sat nearly half a mile west according to the map, tucked near an old bend in the creek where groundwater once supplied the ranch decades ago. Ethan barely remembered it. Just a low stone structure hidden beneath cottonwood trees where his grandfather used to tell him not to wander because snakes liked cool places in summer. Nobody had used it in years, maybe longer. Yet there it sat on the map, circled twice in faded red ink beneath words written in his grandfather's steady hand. Do not trust appearances. Around sunrise, Ethan finally stood and pulled on his old work jacket. All right, he said quietly, folding the map into his pocket. Let us see what your grand plan was. Ranger stood immediately, ready before the sentence even finished. Outside, the ranch looked different after rain. Grass bent gently beneath beads of water, fence posts darkened by moisture, and low morning fog settled across sections of pasture where sunlight had not fully reached. It felt peaceful in a way Ethan had forgotten places could feel. Not empty. Resting. The walk west took nearly 20 minutes. Ranger moved ahead most of the way, occasionally stopping to glance back as though making sure Ethan followed the right direction. The farther they walked, the quieter everything became. No highway noise. No neighbors. Just distant birdsong and the sound of boots pressing softly against damp earth. Finally, through overgrown brush and tangled weeds, Ethan saw it. The spring house looked smaller than memory allowed. Barely larger than a storage shed, built from aging limestone blocks darkened by moss and time. Half the roof sagged inward, and vines climbed the walls like nature had decided to reclaim it years ago. From a distance, it looked useless. Forgotten. Exactly the kind of place nobody would think twice about passing. Ranger slowed near the entrance. Not tense. Focused. Ethan noticed it again immediately. That same alert stillness from the barn. He stepped closer and pushed aside thick weeds near the doorway. Inside smelled of damp stone and cold water. A narrow trough once fed by the underground spring sat cracked and empty against one wall. Broken shelves leaned sideways. Dust. Cobwebs. Silence. Ethan frowned slightly. This is it, he asked quietly. Grandpa sends us half a mile for an old pile of rocks. Ranger ignored him completely. Instead, the German shepherd crossed the room and stopped near the back wall where sunlight slipped through cracks overhead. Then he lowered his nose toward the floor and stood still. Ethan sighed softly. You have got to be kidding me. But when he stepped closer, something caught his attention immediately. One stone near the wall looked cleaner than the others. Slightly different color. Less weathered. Almost as if someone had replaced it long after the building was first built. And carved faintly into its surface sat the same horseshoe and star, symbol Ethan now knew better than to ignore. Ethan crouched slowly beside the marked stone, while Ranger stood close enough for his warm breath to cut through the cool, damp air inside the spring house. Morning light slipped softly through cracks in the old roof, catching dust drifting lazily between weathered limestone walls. Up close, the carved horseshoe and star symbol looked deliberate, carefully etched into the stone by someone who expected only the right person to notice it. Ethan ran his fingers along the edge. Unlike the surrounding stones, this one felt smoother. Less settled somehow. You have got to be kidding me, he muttered quietly, though by now he had stopped believing in coincidence. Ranger lowered his nose near the bottom corner of the wall and nudged it gently once. Then again, patient. Ethan glanced around until he found a broken iron pry bar leaning against an old shelf in the corner. Rust covered most of it, but the metal still felt solid enough. He wedged the edge carefully beneath the marked stone and pushed. At first, nothing happened. Then came a soft grinding sound, stone shifting slowly against hidden hinges. Ethan froze. Hinges. His grandfather had built this on purpose. The slab moved inward several inches before stopping. Behind it sat a narrow compartment built directly into the wall, hidden so carefully that nobody would have found it without knowing exactly where to look. Ranger stepped closer immediately. Inside rested a small steel lockbox, no larger than a shoebox, along with several thick folders wrapped carefully in waterproof cloth. Everything looked untouched despite the passing years. Preserved. Protected. Ethan pulled the lockbox free first. Surprisingly light. A brass latch held it shut, but no lock. When he opened it, he found no money. No gold. No hidden fortune like people in town probably imagined after all those years of gossip. Instead, neatly stacked inside sat old property documents, faded legal papers, and photographs. Ethan frowned in confusion and lifted the first folder. The name printed across the top stopped him cold. Walker Ranch Mineral Rights Survey. Beneath it sat official county paperwork dating back almost 20 years. Ethan flipped through page after page slowly, barely understanding what he was reading at first. Geological reports, land assessments, legal contracts and signed, notes scribbled by his grandfather in the margins. Then one sentence stood out clearly. Rare earth deposits confirmed beneath western acreage. Ethan stared at the page. Rare earth deposits. Valuable minerals. He had heard about them once during a construction job out west. Materials companies fought over. Landowners became wealthy from unexpectedly. His grandfather had known. All this time, he had known. Ranger sat beside him quietly while Ethan continued reading, disbelief slowly giving way to something heavier. The second folder explained more. Years ago, large companies had approached his grandfather offering to buy sections of the ranch quietly. Very quietly. Far below actual value. They assumed he did not understand what rested beneath the land. But he had understood perfectly. One handwritten note rested inside, folded neatly between legal documents. If anybody pushes too hard to buy this place, tell them no. They are not after cattle land. They are after what sits beneath it. Ethan exhaled slowly, overwhelmed. Walter had been right. This had never been about old ranch property. Yet what unsettled him most was not the discovery itself. It was why his grandfather had hidden everything so carefully. Then Ethan noticed one final envelope tucked beneath the paperwork, smaller than the others. On the front, written in familiar steady handwriting, were words that somehow felt heavier than everything else he had already found. Before you decide what this land is worth, remember what people are worth. Ethan sat quietly inside the spring house for a long moment, the unopened envelope resting in his hands while sunlight slowly pushed through the thinning morning clouds outside. Ranger stretched beside him, calm but watchful, his ears occasionally lifting toward distant sounds drifting across the ranch. Somewhere beyond the cottonwood trees, water moved softly through the creek, steady and familiar, like something ancient refusing to rush for anybody. Ethan finally opened the envelope carefully. The paper inside crackled softly with age, folded once, and written entirely in his grandfather's steady handwriting. Ethan, if you made it this far, then you already know more than most people ever did. But before you think about selling this place or chasing numbers on paper, there is something you need to understand. I never kept this land because I was stubborn. I kept it because I knew what it could become if somebody chose people over profit. Ethan frowned slightly and continued reading. When companies found out what rested beneath this ranch, they offered more money than I ever thought I would see. Enough to make life easy. Enough to make most folks stop asking hard questions. But I have seen enough in this world to know that easy money often costs more than people realize. There are veterans in this county sleeping in trucks. Families one paycheck from losing everything. Good men carrying burdens they never talk about because nobody taught them how. This land could make somebody rich, yes. But maybe rich is not the same thing as useful. Ethan lowered the page slowly. Wind moved gently through broken cracks in the spring house roof, carrying the scent of wet grass and cedar. Something about the words settled differently than he expected. Maybe because they sounded painfully true. Somewhere along the way, life had made him tired in quiet ways he rarely admitted. Not just tired of struggling, tired of drifting, of surviving without belonging anywhere. He looked around the forgotten spring house again. Broken stone, dust, quiet. Yet somehow, for the first time in years, he did not feel completely lost. Ranger shifted closer and rested his head gently against Ethan's knee. Ethan scratched behind the dog's ears absent-mindedly before unfolding the second page tucked behind the letter. At the top sat a rough sketch of the ranch. Several buildings had been circled in red ink. The old bunkhouse, the western barn, the empty pasture near the creek. Beneath it, another handwritten message waited. If life has been hard on you, son, then maybe you understand what hard times feel like better than most. Fix the bunkhouse first. Keep the doors open for veterans who need a place to breathe. Let the land help people before it helps banks. You will know what to do. Ethan swallowed hard. He had spent enough nights sleeping inside his pickup to understand exactly what those words meant. The loneliness. The quiet shame people carried when life stopped making sense. Slowly, he folded the letter again and looked out toward the ranch beyond the trees. The place suddenly looked different. Not abandoned. Waiting. Waiting for someone to stop seeing broken buildings and start seeing possibility instead. Ranger stood and walked toward the doorway before glancing back once, tail moving slowly as though asking what came next. Ethan let out a quiet breath and stood too. You know, he said softly, I think he trusted us with more than money. Sunlight broke gently through clouds overhead, warming the pasture in quiet golden light. And somewhere deep inside, something Ethan had almost forgotten how to recognize began slowly finding its way back. Purpose. 6 months later, the ranch no longer felt forgotten. It still carried the same wide Texas sky, the same weathered fences, the same quiet wind moving through pasture grass at sunset. But something about the place had changed. Life had returned slowly, the way healing often does. Not all at once. Not loudly. Just enough each day for hope to settle where loneliness used to live. The old bunkhouse near the western fence had fresh paint now, repaired windows, warm lights glowing softly after dark, and a hand-painted wooden sign near the entrance that simply read Walker House. No grand promises. No advertisements. Just a place for veterans who needed room to breathe for a little while. Some stayed a few nights. Others stayed months. Men carrying quiet burdens they had never found words for. Men who knew what sleeping in trucks felt like. Men who had forgotten what kindness looked like until someone handed them coffee before sunrise and reminded them they still mattered. Ethan never called himself a hero. He mostly fixed broken fences, repaired leaking roofs, and listened more than he talked. Somehow that turned out to matter more than advice ever could. Walter visited often, usually showing up before sunrise with coffee and stories nobody asked for, but everyone secretly appreciated. The old man liked pretending he came to check fence lines, though Ethan knew better. Walter had become family in the quiet, honest way life sometimes surprised people with. As for the mineral rights, Ethan made one decision that shocked almost everybody. He did not sell. Not right away. Lawyers called. Companies offered numbers so large they barely sounded real. Enough money to walk away forever. Enough money to erase every difficult year behind him. But each time he looked at the ranch, at the bunkhouse lights glowing against dark evenings, at veterans sitting quietly around the fire pit sharing stories they once thought nobody would understand, he remembered the letter. Rich is not the same thing as useful. Instead, Ethan created a trust. A portion of future profits, if extraction ever happened responsibly, would go directly into housing support, mental health services, and job training for veterans across the county. The rest would protect the land exactly as his grandfather intended. Ranch first. People first. Profit second. Ranger became something of a legend around the property. Veterans joked he somehow knew exactly who needed company most. He wandered freely between cabins, resting beside people on difficult mornings, waiting quietly near anyone carrying more sadness than words could explain. Nobody really questioned it. Some dogs simply understood things. One cool evening near the end of fall, Ethan sat on the farmhouse porch watching sunset spill gold across the pasture. Ranger rested at his feet, older now somehow, calmer. The barn stood quietly in the distance, weathered but strong, no longer holding secrets quite so heavily. Ethan held the old pocket watch in one hand, turning it gently beneath fading light. He still missed his grandfather. Probably always would. But grief felt different now. Softer around the edges. Less like losing someone and more like carrying them forward. Wind moved gently through the trees while somewhere beyond the pasture, laughter